The Outer Worlds releases on Steam in less than 2 weeks, and in a timely turn of events, there's a lot of growing traction suggesting that The Outer Worlds 2, the sequel, is in production. Is this positive news? Well, I'm a little bit mixed on it, just like I am with the original Outer Worlds. Today I want to discuss the new info on this potential sequel, and also what the follow-up would need to provide to win fans over. Let's jump in and talk about it. Hi, Stelden here. The Outer Worlds was announced at a time when almost everyone had reached a bit of a breaking point with modern RPGs. Not long before it came out, we'd had Fallout 76, which pretty much killed most people's hype for future Bethesda content. And a year before that, BioWare released Mass Effect Andromeda, which pretty much just left people scratching their heads at the state of BioWare. Obsidian Entertainment were left to pick up the pieces, and the Outer Worlds sounded like everyone's dream game. It had a bit of Fallout New Vegas, it had the hub worlds like Mass Effect and Knights of the Old Republic, and it even had a bit of a Bioshock feeling art style about it. When it released, however, its influences overshadowed the rest of the game. It just felt like a really safe carbon copy of a few different RPGs that already existed, and for that reason it just felt unmemorable and unsatisfying to me. So given that, I was fairly surprised to hear that they are making a sequel. They're making a second Outer Worlds. And I'm going to mention now why I believe and why a lot of other people believe this to be the case. So several months ago, a rumour went around that summed up all the projects that Obsidian are currently working on. Now, first and foremost, we know for sure that they're working on another Outer Worlds DLC. That's confirmed as part of the Season Pass, I believe it is, and it's coming out in the first half of next year. Now, the rumours specifically indicated that aside from the confirmed Avowed, which is like a Skyrim-like set in the Pillars of Eternity universe, that they're also working on the Outer Worlds 2, and then another game that we don't know too much about yet. There's also, of course, Grounded, but I don't really care about that. It's like a survival game, it's not an RPG, and who really knows if it's a passion project, or if Microsoft requested it. I mean, I don't want to judge it could be amazing, I just don't really have any interest in it. It's not my thing. So the Outer Worlds 2 and the unannounced project are really what interests me, and first off, Josh Sawyer appears to be directing this unknown title, and back in August he specifically said in a tweet, "I am directing my own project now, it's just not Avowed." So there is a chance he's actually talking about the Outer Worlds 2, you just never know, but apparently that one's actually in pre-production, and they're still talking about different ideas, so I imagine he wouldn't be talking about directing a game where they don't even know the specific direction, it's still kind of up in the air. Very recent and specific evidence for the Outer Worlds 2 though, and this is really why I made the video, it comes from a tweet by Daniel Ahmad. He's fairly well known in the industry from what I gather, and I mean if you're not sold on him, he's got the blue checkmark on Twitter. I mean surely that's all the qualifications one needs to factualize a rumour. Seriously though, I don't think someone who works within a consulting firm for the video game industry would lie about a game like this, since he's not really going to gain anything. This news is really only interesting to enthusiasts like myself and other people who are probably watching. It's not like he's spoiling GTA 6 or something. It's not a sort of tweet that's going to blow up. So I trust this rumour, but keep in mind it's not confirmed. What Daniel says is, last I heard, a new entry in the franchise is being explored. It's currently in pre-production. And the context there is he's actually quoting a Eurogamer article about the Outer Worlds, and he goes on to say that this could change into something else, the project could change into pretty much anything, but the current status is that it's the Outer Worlds 2. So regardless of what this game turns into, it's pretty clear that Obsidian are making another fairly large RPG on top of Avowed, and I think that's the most exciting takeaway here. I honestly couldn't care less if it's Outer Worlds 2 or not. In fact, if they've got a unique idea and they decide to go with that instead and it's a brand new IP, I'd potentially be more enthusiastic. The Outer Worlds is one of those games I don't think anyone particularly dislikes, and that's because it's a pretty harmless game. It's the game equivalent of like a boring talk show host who never has a strong opinion on anything. He just kind of stays neutral on every issue and doesn't really have any personality. That's what the Outer Worlds felt like to me. The issue is, I just felt like Obsidian didn't set out to make their dream game, but it was more like management saw a hole in the market, that hole being what I mentioned earlier, so BioWare and Bethesda doing barely anything of note, not really making any RPGs for their fans, and so they thought they could make a game specifically to plug that gap. The problem is the video game industry just doesn't work like that. A game isn't guaranteed to succeed just because you don't have immediate competition, because people can just go and replay old games. I got halfway through the Outer Worlds and realised I'd rather replay a different RPG than continue to slog through it, unfortunately. I mean, every second game that comes out these days, it's a remake, it's a remaster, so that is legitimate competition. You need to make a good RPG, or people are just going to go, oh, fuck it, I'm just going to go back and play Fallout again. And I didn't have that urge to go and play something else because the game was necessarily bad, it's just that it didn't really grab me. It's a tired old tale of corporations bad, little man good, but it doesn't really do anything exciting with that storyline, it just keeps repeating the same ideas. Aside from that, you've got the modern Fallout style looting where every nook and cranny's got 100 useless things to pick up. Now, in Fallout it absolutely worked because ammo was quite scarce, and trying to loot what you could absolutely suited the desolate setting that you're in. But in the Outer Worlds, it just seemed to be there to give people New Vegas nostalgia, and nothing really more than that. You then had the characters, who I can barely name even if I think about them, and the world itself, outside the towns, is just fairly boring. The colour palette gets repetitive really fast, and overall, I just want to be retreading that ground again in a sequel. It's not going to interest me at all. If we are getting the Outer Worlds 2, I really think Obsidian need to ask themselves what the series' identity is, because aside from the corporation stuff, there's not a lot there that separates it from any other games. Like, if I described it on paper, you're not going to think, oh, that is 100% the Outer Worlds, that's fantastic. You're probably going to go, oh, is it Fallout, is it something else? It's just not really distinguishable in a lot of ways. And I mean, if they want to copy Fallout, why don't they just go to Uncle Phil's office, the boss of Xbox in case you didn't know, and ask him for permission to use Fallout, since they own the IP now after all. Honestly though, that wouldn't be a bad result, as Obsidian have shown their passion for the IP in the past, and given that IP's a guaranteed sales success, they could go nuts with creativity instead of phoning it in like they did for the Outer Worlds, which I assume wasn't due to the lack of talent, but because they wanted to appeal to different demographics of the RPG space. They wanted the people who love first-person shooting. Like in Fallout 4, they wanted people who love the looting as well as making choices, and I just think when you're just trying to tick boxes to appease certain demographics, you're going to lose some of the integrity and creativity from the project you were trying to create from the start. Now, the other option is that they don't go back to Fallout and they say, right, we're committed to the Outer Worlds, it was a success in its own right, and I don't know if that's the case, by the way. I assume it must have sold reasonably well if they're entertaining the idea of a sequel, but I honestly don't know. If this is the way they want to do it, I think they just really need to tone down the very obvious Fallout influences. Now, take the good stuff for sure, like the great characters, the choices, that stuff's always awesome, but I'm talking about like the really noticeable stuff, like the looting style being exactly like New Vegas, because I feel that's not something that's actually true to Obsidian. It was only in New Vegas because they were working off Bethesda's Gamebryo engine. They don't need to do that when working on their own terms. They can focus on quality over quantity. I want to see hub worlds that are really memorable the whole way through. I don't just want a town and then these areas of emptiness around it. I want them to make the outside world really compact and interesting. They also need to come up with an intriguing combat system that isn't centered around bullet spongy enemies. Obsidian put effort into customizing your loadout and your combat abilities, but given that every enemy felt like it could just be gunned down the same way, it made spending time with those systems feel useless. There was also a feeling from a lot of people that budget may have been something that was stopping Obsidian from making the game they truly wanted to make, and that is a fair defense. We know it was published by Private Division, who were owned by Take-Two, and their purpose was around financing mid-sized budget games, and if mid-size is the aim, it may explain the Outer Worlds not quite having the resources it needed to be special. Under Microsoft, you'd assume that wouldn't be a problem and the sky would be the limit for budget. I mean, they've bought something like 15 studios in the last week or month or however long it's been, so you would hope that also means they're willing to invest in quality games if they need to. I do think if the Outer Worlds IP is truly going to grow, then they'll certainly have to go all out, because while the first game's got its fans, I think the majority are at best a bit indifferent about the game, and they're not going to rush to pick up a sequel unless it's promising a whole lot more. More of the same's just not going to cut it, and Obsidian have been down this road before recently, because Pillars of Eternity 2 came out. Most people, most fans, considered it to be better than the first game, but it sold like half as many copies, and that's because a lot of people, they enjoyed Pillars 1, but they thought, it was alright, I can get that experience somewhere else. I don't really care about the sequel that much. I've already kind of experienced what that world probably has to offer. So that game, I wouldn't say it bombed, but it didn't do very well, so they can't do the same thing again with the Outer Worlds. Now, I certainly don't think every single game needs to reinvent the wheel, so I'm not really asking the Outer Worlds 2 to do that. It doesn't need to pioneer a whole bunch of new stuff, but it does need to feel unique. To prove that point, back when the first game came out, it had a very close release date to Disco Elysium, which likely had a much smaller budget, and it was definitely made by a very small team. I felt like in RPG circles though, Disco Elysium had a much stronger reaction, and far more people were passionate about it, even if technically the Outer Worlds probably had more players. And I do think its uniqueness is why that happened, so Obsidian do need to look at their own style, their strengths, and really hone in on those if they're going to make something special. I think it's a challenge Obsidian have had trouble overcoming. They've had original games like Alpha Protocol in the past, but since then, a lot of their original IPs haven't quite hit the heights of New Vegas and Knights of the Old Republic 2 in terms of quality. I know Pillars of Eternity has a lot of fans, but it just felt like in some ways to be a poor man's Baldur's Gate, whereas something like Pathfinder Kingmaker, it felt like the next step, it felt expansive, it felt like even more than Baldur's Gate in some ways. So that is my challenge to them, to focus on their strengths, take risks, and really go all out for the Outer Worlds 2, because by the time it does come out, which I assume is going to be at least 3 or 4 years from now, it's probably going to have much more competition than the original did. They won't be able to ride on the fact that most RPG developers like BioWare had basically given up. We'll be in a post-cyberpunk world, whatever that means, and we're going to find that out in November. Jesus Christ, it's a month away from now, but we'll also potentially have Avowed by then, which means people are going to have an internal Obsidian game to compare to the Outer Worlds 2. And I know I just mentioned them, but BioWare is likely going to have Dragon Age 4 out by then, which probably needs to be good for that studio to survive. And then along with that, Bethesda's Starfield will be out, which I'm betting is going to be a 2022 game. I don't think it's going to be any longer than that we'll have to wait. And if that is all the case, the Outer Worlds 2 may have some competition on its hands if it wants to be this big new IP, and the first game just did it no real favours. I want to jump back briefly for a second though, because I mentioned Josh Sawyer earlier and the RPG he's working on. Now for those who don't know, he was the director of Fallout New Vegas, so he's got a lot of goodwill with RPG fans. And he's also talked about wanting to make a historic RPG for a long time, and that is one of those rumours I mentioned that's been floating around. So what I'm thinking is if that is the game he's directing, and then we look at Microsoft who own all of these different IPs, they own all these different studios, is it possible that the game he's working on is a historical RPG within the Age of Empires series? I know it's a different genre, but given Age of Empires 4 is already happening, I don't think it would necessarily annoy fans. It's not like Diablo Immortal or that Command & Conquer mobile game when there was like no plans for traditional titles that were officially in the works, so this would be a bit different. If Josh's RPG was in the Age of Empires series, I think it would really help sales for it, given a brand new IP being marketed as historic and realistic may seem uncool to some people, since there won't be any chance of anything too ridiculous happening, you would think. That is a massive guess though, and that's why I saved it for the end of the video, but I just think it's interesting to consider all the cross-studio projects that are possible now that Microsoft seemingly own everything. And I want to make the most of it before they monopolize the whole gaming industry and all of these good games disappear and we're left with crap. I'm not totally serious about that, but there is a fear in the back of my mind of that happening, to be honest, but hopefully it is a long way off. I'll say that I'm normally a little bit mixed when it comes to talking about rumours and leaks that are going on, and that's just because so many of them are unfounded, and you start talking about it, it sounds exciting, a week later it's completely unproven and it starts to look a bit stupid. So I'm talking about this one because I just feel, even if it's not the Outer Worlds 2 that ends up happening, we know that another game is going on at Obsidian. At least one. There's the Josh Sawyer one that I mentioned as well. So you never know, a few games could come out over the next few years from then, which will be a little bit different than just like the odd game every so often. So that can be kind of exciting if they take some of this feedback on board. And they've still got a lot of talented people at the studio. You've got Tim Kaine, who created Fallout. He was one of the guys responsible for Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. He was behind the studio who made that. So much potential there. They're not really utilizing it, I think, at the moment. So hopefully now is their moment to kind of take a lot of those lessons on board and make something happen. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks very much for watching. And if you did, please comment, like, and subscribe. I'll see you on the next one. Thanks again, and bye-bye.